She sat at my kitchen table and would not touch the food. I had made scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and a glass of orange juice. A simple breakfast, the kind of thing any kid would wake up for. My niece Della sat with both hands pressed flat against her thighs, spine perfectly straight, staring at the plate like it was something dangerous. She was 8 years old, and she had the posture of someone who had learned, very early, not to take up too much space. I pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. "Della," I said gently, "you need to eat something, sweetheart." She looked up at me. Her eyes were large and dark and absolutely serious. "How much does it cost?" she whispered. I didn't understand at first. "What do you mean, honey? What costs?" "The food." She said it quietly like a secret. "How much does the food cost? I don't want to eat too much and make you angry." I want to tell you that I stayed calm. That is what I told myself I had to do in that moment. Stay calm, don't frighten her, let her finish. But the truth is that something moved through my chest when she said those words, something cold and sharp, and it took every year of professional discipline. I had to keep my voice steady. Before I tell you what I found in the days that followed, let me introduce myself. My name is Hugo. I am 63 years old, and I spent 30 years as a forensic accountant. I sat across tables from people who believed their financial crimes were invisible, people who had constructed elaborate paper trails designed to disguise theft as legitimate expense. My job was to find the lie buried inside the numbers. I was good at it. I thought, when I retired, that I was done with that kind of work. I was wrong. My younger sister Jolene had called me Thursday evening, her voice carrying the familiar tremor I had been hearing since she was a teenager. She was the kind of person who performed distress the way other people performed joy, dramatically, just slightly over the top. She told me she and her husband Kurt were in serious financial trouble. The second mortgage, a business deal gone bad. She might lose the house. She needed someone to take Della for a few days, while she and Kurt met with creditors and tried to figure out what to do. Could I please help her? She was at her wit's end. I said, of course. When Jolene pulled into my driveway the next afternoon, I was standing on the front porch. She drove a 2-year-old Mercedes SUV with chrome trim and tinted windows, which was not what I expected from someone on the edge of foreclosure. She stepped out wearing a linen blazer, sunglasses that retailed for several $100s, and sandals from a brand that doesn't offer anything under $200. She looked like she was going to brunch, not a creditor meeting. I filed that detail in the back of my mind and watched her open the rear passenger door. Della climbed down from the seat in a faded blue dress that had gone thin at the elbows, with sneakers where the rubber was separating from the canvas at the toe. She was small for 8, smaller than she should have been, I thought, though I hadn't seen her in close to a year. Jolene did not crouch down to hug her daughter. She did not say goodbye to her face. She handed me a duffel bag that was soft and nearly flat. There couldn't have been more than a day or two of clothing inside, and said, "Thank you so much, Hugo. You have no idea what we're going through right now. She can be a little difficult. Just don't let her overdo it on the snacks." Then she climbed back into her Mercedes, reversed out of my driveway, and was gone before Della had finished watching her leave. Della stood on my front walk and said nothing. She just looked at the street for a moment, then down at her shoes. "Let's get you settled," I said. She followed me inside and answered every question I asked. "Yes, sir." "No, sir," in the careful, flat voice of a child who had learned that answers should take up as little room as possible. So that brings me back to the kitchen table, to the plate of eggs she wouldn't touch, to the question about how much the food cost. I kept my voice low and steady. "The food doesn't cost you anything, Della. You eat as much as you want. That's what I made it for." She looked at me for a long moment, as though she was waiting for the part where the offer was withdrawn. "Mom says I eat too much," she finally said. "She says everything costs money, and I don't understand how hard they work. She measures out my dinner on a kitchen scale. She says I'm always asking for more, and it's selfish." "She weighs your meals," I said. Della nodded. "She puts my plate on the little silver scale before she brings it to me. If I'm still hungry after, I'm not supposed to say so. If I say so, she says I'm ungrateful. She says I've always cost more than I'm worth." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. I told her, clearly and slowly, that no child costs more than they are worth. That food is not a reward, that she was going to eat as much as she needed, and no one in my house was going to be angry with her for it. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she picked up her fork. I watched her eat and thought about Jolene's Mercedes and her designer sandals, And I thought about the fact that I was a man who had spent 30 years following paper trails. And I thought, something does not add up here. About an hour later, Della mentioned her allergy medication. She had a severe nut allergy, the kind that required an EpiPen, the kind where the margin for error is measured in minutes. It had not been packed in the duffel bag. Jolene had simply left it behind. My neighbor across the street, Bet, a retired emergency room nurse, was home. I knocked on her door and explained the situation. She didn't hesitate. She was back at my kitchen table with Della and a deck of cards before I had my jacket on. I told Della I'd be back in an hour, and I meant it. Jolene lived about 25 minutes away in a neighborhood where the driveways were sealed and the flower beds were professionally maintained. She had given me a spare key 2 years earlier for emergencies, and I used it now, stepping into the front hallway. The house was quiet and cool and smelled like a candle that cost more than I spend on groceries in a week. There were family photos on the walls. Jolene and Kurt at what looked like a resort. Jolene and Kurt at a wine dinner somewhere. Not a single photograph of Della. I found what I assumed was Della's room based on its location, a short door at the end of the hall, near the door to the garage. I pushed it open. It was a utility room, a cot against one wall, a bare bulb in the ceiling, a plastic bin of clothes in the corner. The walls were unfinished drywall. A small window near the ceiling, no larger than a vent, let in a thin stripe of afternoon light. The EpiPen was sitting on top of the bin, next to a comb with several tines broken off. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Then I took out my phone and started photographing everything. After I found the EpiPen, I should have walked out. But 30 years of forensic accounting have made me something other than reasonable when I see a discrepancy this severe. I walked to Jolene's home office, clean, organized, clearly used for real work. I found what I was looking for in the second drawer of her desk, a manila folder marked, in Jolene's neat handwriting, Della Trust Correspondence. Della's father had died in a car accident when Della was 5. He had been a quiet, careful man who worked in insurance and had apparently practiced what he preached. He left behind a life insurance policy worth $1.8 million, held in a formal trust for Della. Jolene had been appointed sole trustee. I pulled out the bank statements. Every month, on the 3rd of the month, an automatic transfer of $7,500 moved from the trust account into a joint checking account held by Jolene and Kurt. The memo line on every single transfer read the same thing: specialized therapeutic and dietary care expenses. I did the math without needing a calculator. $90,000 a year, drawn from a trust established by a dead man to protect his daughter. While that daughter slept on a cot in a utility room and had her dinner measured out on a kitchen scale. I photographed every page. Before I left, I noticed something on the kitchen counter, half hidden under a takeout menu. A travel confirmation folder from a resort company. I opened it, a 12-night all-inclusive booking at a luxury property in Los Cabos, Mexico. 2 guests. Departure date: the day Jolene dropped Della off at my house. Total charge, $15,400. The creditor meeting was a beach vacation. I photographed every page of that as well, closed everything exactly as I found it, and left. Jolene called me that evening, right on schedule. I heard the sound of water in the background, not the hum of a hotel HVAC system, but actual water, rhythmic and close, the way the ocean sounds when you're sitting above it on a terrace. She told me the creditor situation was worse than expected. She might need another week on the road. Was I managing okay with Della? Was she behaving? She sometimes had these episodes, Jolene said. She would just shut down, refuse to cooperate. The school counselor had raised concerns. They'd had her evaluated twice and nothing had helped. It was just so hard. She and Kurt were completely drained. She's been fine, I said. We're doing great. I heard Jolene pause on the line, the slight recalibration of someone who wanted a different answer. She hasn't given you any trouble? No trouble at all, I said. Just relax and handle your business. We'll manage. I hung up and sat for a moment in my kitchen, listening to Della watch television in the other room. Then I called Attorney Pryor. David Pryor had been my attorney for 15 years. He was a former federal prosecutor who now specialized in trust litigation and financial fraud, the kind of man who, when you put a suspicious bank statement in front of him, leans forward rather than back. I drove to his office that Saturday morning and laid everything out: the photographs, the trust documents, the travel itinerary, what Della had told me at the breakfast table. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Hugo, I need to check something." He turned to his computer. What he found was a preliminary filing in the county family court, submitted 3 weeks earlier, requesting an involuntary residential mental health placement for a minor. The minor's name was Della. The filing described her as exhibiting dangerous and uncontrollable behavior, chronic refusal to eat, emotional dysregulation, and an inability to function in a normal family environment. It was signed by Jolene and Kurt. Attorney Pryor explained what the filing meant in plain terms. If a judge granted the petition, Della would be placed in a state-run residential facility. Jolene and Kurt would retain legal guardianship. They would also retain complete control of the trust, and they had noted in the filing that they would need to continue drawing the monthly stipend to cover supplementary expenses not covered by state placement. They were going to put Della in an institution, not because she was troubled, because they wanted to keep the money without having to house the child. I sat in Attorney Pryor's office and did the math again. The state facility would cost them nothing. The trust would continue paying them $7,500 a month. Over Della's remaining childhood, that was hundreds of thousands of dollars, all of it siphoned from the savings her father had died to protect her with. The preliminary hearing is in 10 days, Attorney Pryor said. Then we have 10 days, I said. They came back on a Tuesday afternoon, 5 days after they had dropped Della off. I watched through the front window as they stepped out of the Mercedes. They were both deeply tanned in the specific way of people who have been lying in the sun for 12 days straight. The kind of tan you don't get from a creditor meeting. Jolene was in a bright yellow sundress. Kurt had on cargo shorts and a polo, relaxed in the way of a man who had not recently been fighting to save his home. I answered the door before they could knock. I had not slept well. My hair was unkempt, I hadn't shaved, and the dark circles under my eyes were entirely genuine. I had spent the last 2 nights coordinating with Attorney Pryor, a detective from the County Financial Crimes Unit named Detective Shea, and 2 Child Protective Services field investigators. I looked like a man at the end of his rope, which was almost true, except the rope was in my hands, not around my neck. "Hugo," Jolene said, stepping inside and letting out a long, theatrical exhale. "I cannot tell you how glad I am to be back. This trip was just brutal. We are absolutely wrung out." Kurt shook my hand. "You're a lifesaver," he said, "truly." I told them they looked tired. I said we needed to sit down and talk about Della before they took her home, because something had happened that I didn't want to discuss in front of her. I showed them to the dining table. They sat down with the eager, poorly disguised hunger of people who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. I told them, in a slow and heavy voice, that the last few days had been a lot. That Della was different from what I'd expected, that she'd gotten upset at mealtimes, asked strange questions, been withdrawn in a way that concerned me. I borrowed every word from Jolene's court filing and fed it back to her. Jolene leaned forward. "That's exactly what we deal with," she said. "Every single day. I'm so sorry you had to see it." I asked them quietly what they were planning to do. That was when Jolene's performance shifted from sympathetic to strategic. She talked about a residential program, very specialized, very structured, designed for children with severe behavioral profiles. She said it wasn't cheap, and with everything they were dealing with financially, they were struggling to cover the intake fees. She looked at me and said, "We were actually hoping, Hugo, that you might be able to help us with the upfront cost. Just a loan, $8,000. We'd pay you back as soon as things stabilize." Kurt put his hand on the table, palm up, open, waiting. I looked at this man, this parasite, this fraud sitting across from me in his resort tan, asking me to fund the abandonment of his own stepdaughter. I thought about the food scale on Jolene's kitchen counter. I thought about that bare cot in the utility room. I thought about Della asking me if the eggs were going to make me angry. I reached down beside my chair. I placed the folder on the table and slid it across to them. Jolene opened it slowly, and I watched the color leave her face in stages, like a tide going out. The first page was the travel confirmation. 12 nights, Los Cabos, 2 guests, departure matching the afternoon she had stood in my driveway talking about creditors and financial ruin. The second page was the trust fund statement with the transaction history. Every third of the month, $7,500, specialized therapeutic and dietary care expenses, deposited into their joint account. "Hugo," Jolene said. Her voice had changed completely. The performance was gone. "This isn't what it looks like." "It looks," I said, "exactly like what it is." Kurt started to stand up. He told me I had no right to enter their home, that I had violated their privacy, that any evidence I'd gathered was inadmissible, that they had a lawyer who would make my life very difficult. He was leaning across the table now, voice rising, hands flat on the wood, doing the thing people do when they've been caught and have nothing left but volume. I asked him calmly if he really wanted to call law enforcement. He didn't answer, but someone else did. The door to my home office opened. Detective Shea walked out first, badge clipped at his belt, followed by 2 CPS investigators and Attorney Pryor. They had been in that room for 2 hours. They had heard every word. Jolene made a sound I won't try to describe. Detective Shea introduced himself and informed them that they were being detained on suspicion of criminal misappropriation of a minor's trust fund, child neglect, and filing fraudulent documentation with the family court. He told Kurt to step back from the table. Kurt did not immediately comply. Detective Shea was not going to ask a second time. One of the CPS investigators handed me a document, an emergency protective order, signed that morning, granting me temporary custody of Della pending the outcome of the investigation. Jolene tried to speak several times. She said I had set them up. She said she had done the best she could. She said the trust money was rightfully theirs for everything they had sacrificed. She was still talking when the handcuffs went on. I walked them out to the front step. The afternoon was soon clear and warm, and 3 of my neighbors were on their lawns, watching in the quiet way that suburban people watch things they will discuss for years. Jolene, in her yellow sundress, was placed in the back of a police vehicle. Kurt followed a few steps behind, the easy confidence entirely drained from his posture. The car doors closed. I stood on my front porch until they drove away. 6 months have passed since that Tuesday afternoon. Jolene pleaded guilty to misappropriation of trust funds. The evidence was too thorough for any other path. Kurt's trial is still pending. Their assets, the Mercedes, the contents of their joint accounts, the designer wardrobe, have been seized as part of the recovery process for Della's trust. The $1.8 million is now held by a court-appointed independent trustee, and Attorney Pryor has made sure it is wrapped in legal protections that would take a team of specialists years to untangle. My application for permanent guardianship was approved 7 weeks ago. Della's room has yellow walls. She chose the color herself from a strip of paint samples I fanned out on the kitchen table. She has a real bed with a thick comforter, a bookshelf we built together on a Saturday afternoon, and a rug the color of summer grass. There's a photograph of her father on the nightstand. She picked that out herself, too. The healing has not been instant. For the first month, she still asked sometimes if it was okay to have more. She would leave small portions on her plate even when she was still hungry, as though eating everything might set off an alarm. I never made a production of it. I just kept the pantry stocked and the kitchen open. And every time she asked, I told her there was no such thing as too much at my table. This morning, she made herself a bowl of cereal before I was even out of bed. I found her at the kitchen table with the sports section of the newspaper. She'd taken it from the stack because she'd seen me read it. Eating Cheerios and looking at the box scores with the focused expression of someone who had no particular interest in baseball, but was enjoying the act of choosing her own morning. She didn't ask if it was okay. She didn't look up when I came in, not from indifference, but from comfort, the easy comfort of a child who knows that a kitchen is a safe place and that the person walking into it is not a threat. I poured my coffee and sat down across from her, and I didn't say anything at all for a little while. I just watched her eat. There are people who will tell you that family is family, that blood creates an obligation, that you protect your own no matter what they do, because they are your own. I spent 30 years proving that the most elegant frauds are always built on exactly that kind of assumption. The assumption that loyalty can be weaponized, that people will look the other way from something terrible if the person doing it shares their last name. What I know sitting at this kitchen table at 63 years old, watching my niece eat cereal in the morning light, is something simpler than all of that. The numbers always tell the truth. The record always surfaces. And a man who has spent his life learning to read what is actually written, not what someone claims is written, will never be entirely surprised by what he finds. Della looked up from the newspaper and caught me watching her. "What?" she said, in the suspicious, slightly annoyed way that means she's not actually suspicious at all. "Nothing," I said. She went back to the box scores, and I drank my coffee, and the morning was exactly what it was.